All right, welcome to Concept 3 Notes. We're going to be talking about the immune system. And to me, this is like one of the most amazing examples in our body of homeostatic regulation, just from a system level, but all the way down to a cellular level. I think a lot of times in some of the systems, we've spent a lot of time looking at the different organs and things like that. But the immune system is really just run by the cells on a cellular level, and that just impacts everything else. And all of the systems are like that, but I just feel like we can see that played out easiest in the immune system. I think it's also just really unique to some of the other body systems because it's using the organs and tissues that are in a variety of other systems. It doesn't just have its like own cluster of special immune organs. Specifically, you'll see it from just covering in concept 2 the lymphatic system. I mean, we're going to be using lymphoid tissues and lymphoid organs to accomplish the immune system's goals. So it's just really highly collaborative, and that's one of the reasons why I save it for Unit 6 protection, Concept 3, so the end of one of our very last units, just so we can do it towards the end of this school year and kind of refer back to all these other systems we've talked about. Y'all, this is a very, very complex system. I know it can be very overwhelming. I've done my best to narrow it down to what I think are the most important topics for you to understand. So just know that there's so much more detail we could go into. So I want you to know what I am providing very, very well. So even if you feel a little overwhelmed, just know this is just barely skimming the surface. Okay, so let's start with a little overview. The function of your immune system is to recognize, fight, but also just defend against foreign substances all the way down to at a cellular level. And it's relying heavily on white blood cells. That's what WBCs mean, specifically lymphocytes, like the B cells and T cells that are in your lymphoid tissues and organs that we talked about in Concept 2. And the goal eventually would be to achieve immunity, which is just a way of saying resistance to disease. That's what immunity would mean. So, what are we trying to get immunity from? Well, a word hopefully you are familiar with is a pathogen. It's a a microorganism like a bacterium, but it could also be a virus. Remember, viruses are not living things, so they're not considered microorganisms. But it's basically one of those things that can cause disease. So, it's a disease-causing agent. And one thing I think that is especially interesting about this system, which I meant to mention, is that it's actually like structurally not even considered its own organ system, but it is a unique system functionally. So that's why we're really just going to be talking physiology in this concept, especially. Okay, so pathogens and antigens. A lot of times those two words are used interchangeably. They are not the same thing, okay? But they are definitely related. So a pathogen is a microorganism or virus that causes disease. An antigen is anything that causes an immune system response. So it could be in a pathogen, it's like the part of the pathogen that your body sees and says that's foreign and then learns how to respond to. But it doesn't necessarily have to be part of a pathogen. So, yes, there are antigens in the pathogens of bacteria and fungi and viruses, but an antigen could also just be a toxin, or it could be a diseased or cancerous cell in your own body, has antigens on it that your body would mark as foreign. So they aren't like necessarily one is not always the other and vice versa. So essentially all an antigen is doing, it's some part of something that's acting as a signaling molecule that's causing and signaling an immune response in your body. And that response could be the production of antibodies. Antibodies are just proteins that our immune system uses to bind to these antigens and then to neutralize their effect on the body or neutralize the pathogens, if specifically the antigen is on a pathogen. And again, antigens aren't always like necessarily like some toxic bad disease carrying thing. It just means your body sees it and says that is other, that is foreign. So if you remember from Unit 4 transport, we learned about blood type and your red blood cells and how they have proteins on their plasma membranes that are antigens, and our body can only tolerate blood that has the same antigens as our blood cells because we make antibodies against the other ones. And so you can go back and review that from Concept 1 Blood of Unit 4 Transport if you want. So just know that the pathogen is an actual like disease-causing bacterium or fungus or virus, whereas the antigen is like the part of the pathogen or just the part of something that signals the body, this is foreign, respond to it. So basically our body has two systems of defenses that it will kind of put into play. We have innate defenses and adaptive defenses. The innate ones are non-specific. They just kind of apply. We'll talk about each in more detail. It's on guard at all times. It's ready to attack anything and everything just without specificity. We consider our innate defenses kind of like our first and second lines of defense. And it's a pretty rapid response time. It's going to respond to some sort of invader within 0 to 96 hours. So 0 time to basically 4 days. Some of the mechanisms of our innate defense system are physical surface barriers like mucus and skin, antimicrobial proteins using fever and inflammation, a process called phagocytosis of engulfing and destroying harmful substances, and then white blood cells like our natural killer cells. You don't need to write these here because we're going to go through these in detail, but I'm just listing them for an overview's sake. All right, our adaptive defense system is a much more elite fighting force, but it's only equipped to attack substances that we already know are foreign. So we kind of have to learn them because they're specific to pathogens. They have a specific fighting mechanism for each pathogen or antigen that we come across. It's our third line of defense. It's acquired, so it's something that your body has to develop. But the nice thing is that it remembers. So it's going to use B cells and T cells, which are two types of lymphocytes, in order to attack and then also remember that attack plan in case you get invaded by the same substance again in the future. The response time is usually greater than 96 hours. It's longer, it takes longer and is slower, but it's a longer lasting response because, again, it remembers. And we're going to use mechanisms of humoral immunity, which is B cells and antibodies, and then also cellular immunity, which is T cells. And so again, we're going to go through each of these in a lot of detail. Don't worry. So let's start with innate defenses. First line of defense is your external surface barriers. So that basically is including your skin, which is just like a literal physical mechanical barrier. We saw, though, in Concept 1, the integumentary system, how your skin is a barrier both physically, chemically, and biologically. So it's just a great barrier. But then also mucous membrane. So you may remember this from Unit 1 forever ago, but your body cavities that open into the exterior are all lined with this mucosa, these mucous membranes. So we're talking, think like your respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive tracts that have openings, again, to the external environment. Those have this lining in there which helps protect them. So how does it help protect? Well, a lot of these mucous membranes secrete protective chemicals, so acid secretion. So like your saliva and your sweat and your urine and even vaginal secretions are all a little bit acidic, and so that helps fighting microbes. They have enzymes in them, defensins, these antimicrobial proteins that can help too. And then you also just have other protective features associated with your skin and these mucous membranes, like your nasal hairs or cilia in your respiratory and digestive tract, and just mucus in general. All of those things also play into this first line of defense in protecting your body from pathogens. All right, our second line of defense is still an innate defense, but it's internal. And so one of those mechanisms is using a fever. A fever is just an abnormally high body temperature. And it's a systemic response to invaders. So as you know, a fever affects your whole body, even though you may only have bacteria present in one location. So essentially, pyrogens are released by your immune cells, and that raises your body's temperature, giving you the fever. And what that helps with is it helps to inhibit pathogens from multiplying and spreading into other cells. And then it also increases the metabolic rate of your tissue cells. And that helps with speeding up just the repair process in general. So if you have a fever, it's not a bad thing. It's your body trying, to fight an attack. Another line of internal defense is antimicrobial proteins. So they are proteins that attack microorganisms either directly or they just make it hard for a microorganism to reproduce. So an example of that are interferons. They're really small signaling proteins that cells that are infected with viruses secrete, and then these signaling proteins, they diffuse to the nearby cells around them that haven't been affected yet by the virus, and they try to block the cell from having a virus take over. And also, they help send a signal to get the rest of the immune system going. So they are protective and but also mobilizing as well. And then complement proteins are proteins in your plasma that, when they get activated, help to amplify our inflammatory response, which we'll talk about inflammation in a second. Sometimes we just refer to them as complement. And they also can lyse microorganisms too. So they play that sort of role as well. And then another line of defense are your defensive cells, which are your white blood cells, specifically phagocytes and natural killer cells, or NK cells. So that's what I'm going to dive into next. So phagocytes are just defensive cells that eat pathogens to get rid of them. They don't really have a mouth. That's why I don't say they eat, but they basically engulf them and then break them down. Two types are neutrophils. They're the most abundant white blood cell, and when a neutrophil goes to a site of infection and does phagocytosis to get rid of the infection, it creates pus. So pus is another sign, like fever, that we're usually, not happy with, but it's your body's own way of healing itself. And then there's also macrophages, which literally means big eaters. We talked about them with our integumentary system concept in concept 1. And they use cytoplasmic extensions to basically reel in and then eat foreign invaders. And phagocytosis is just the process of ingesting these pathogens and getting rid of them. And I love this picture from the CDC. It basically shows a mesothelial cell in a mouse taking in a bacterium via phagocytosis. That's what it would look like, which is pretty cool. So just the general process, you don't need to write this down or anything, but first and second two pictures, what we kind of see is a phagocyte adhering to the pathogen or debris that it's going to be taking in via a receptor that can receive it. That's what we see kind of right there. In the third picture, we see the pathogen basically being engulfed. It's being pulled inside, enveloped by a vesicle through endocytosis, which you may remember from Biology 1. And then lysosomes, if you remember that organelle, they're enzymes, such as lysozymes, basically can fuse with that vesicle and form something called a phagolysosome. That's what we see here, just when they're fused together. And then those lysosomal enzymes or lysozymes destroy the pathogens and digest them. And sometimes if it can't fully digest the debris or the pathogen, whatever it is, exocytosis will occur to kind of release the indigestible material from the cell, and then that'll get disposed of in a different way. But essentially, it's just eating a pathogen. All right, natural killer cells are the other type of defensive cell I wanted to mention, NK cells. These defensive cells can actually kill your own cells. And so instead of eating a pathogen to get rid of it, they actually trigger apoptosis in whatever cell is marked as foreign. If they recognize or identify the cell as infected. So this helps with killing cancer cells in the body and also virus-infected cells because it sees you're infected, and so it tells the cell basically to kill itself. How does it do that? It uses a protein called perforin, and it kind of creates these pores or pokes these holes in the cell membrane of whatever cell is infected, and then it injects enzymes through those pores, like an enzyme called granzyme, and then that stimulates a cell to then do programmed cell death, which is apoptosis. We call them natural killer cells because of their lack of specificity. Basically, if they see any cell that they identify as other than or as not natural, then they will trigger apoptosis in it. Our adaptive cells and our adaptive immune response or our adaptive defense system are much more specific in their attack plans based on the specific antigens that they come across. This is just saying you are other and I will attack you. And this is the same attack strategy, though, or mechanism as cytotoxic T cells, which we'll talk about a little bit later, of like punching the hole in or creating the pore and then injecting the enzymes and stimulating apoptosis. All right, last part of innate defense I want to talk about is inflammation. This is another, again, all these are non-specific responses to an issue or an injured tissue. It's basically like sounding an internal chemical alarm in your body. It mobilizes phagocytes to go and eat up any pathogens. And the injured and stressed tissue cells and immune cells in the area will release inflammatory chemicals. And those are what cause the inflammation. So here are some of those chemicals, like histamine. You've probably heard of Benadryl is an antihistamine you take after you've had a bug bite and you want the swelling to go down. Well, histamine is a good thing. It causes this inflammation by promoting your arterioles to vasodilate, which increases the flow of blood to the site of the injury. Basophils and mast cells are two types of white blood cells. We're not going to go into all the different types because there's so many, but they are some of the ones that release histamine. Another group of inflammatory chemicals are kinins and prostaglandins. They also promote that arterial vasodilation, and then they also induce that feeling of pain. Complement proteins we mentioned before, they just help amplify this response. And then cytokines are chemical messenger proteins of our immune system, and they aid in just coordinating this entire process. And inflammation is a good thing because it helps your body fight infection by preventing damage invaders from spreading to other tissues. Obviously, getting rid of cell debris and pathogens with the phagocytes that get mobilized. It alerts our adaptive defense systems that like something is going on, which is important. And then it gets the injured area ready to be prepared with all of that blood flow, which is going to bring nutrients. So I like this picture because it kind of shows what could be happening under the surface of the skin as your body is, say repairing itself from a cut. So let's say you're wounded by a cut from a sharp knife and bacteria enter that wound. Your immune cells and your injured tissue cells, they're going to release chemicals, those inflammatory chemicals like histamine. So those would get released in your blood. And then your cytokines would start to initiate that tissue to repair. And then antimicrobial proteins will show up and basically start, getting the phagocytes. And we're going to start getting rid of this bacteria here. And we're going to start clotting where it's been injured, even though you can see where it's getting inflamed. And then as the inflammation is going down and it's healing, we can notice that the bacteria has been getting consumed by those phagocytes and the wound is healing. So inflammation is an important line of our defense. All right, now we're going to talk about adaptive defenses. So this is our third line of defense, and it's a built-in specific defensive system. It is it's not restricted just to the initial reaction location like innate often is. It can work everywhere. It's basically mainly using lymphocytes, which are B cells and T cells, APCs, which we'll talk about, and then other molecules to identify and destroy these antigens. So remember, an antigen is a marker on a pathogen or on a substance that the body sees and says is foreign. And our adaptive defense only works if the following things happen. Has to be able to recognize and remember antigens. So it has to be introduced to a specific pathogen or antigen and then know that it is a threat. Okay, so that's something you would have to remember. Then it has to be able to bind to those, and then it has to be able to communicate with all these other cells in order to initiate this specific response that needs to happen. Fun fact, babies are not born with adaptive immunity at all because it takes time to develop. So babies that are breastfed receive antibodies from the mother's breast milk, but they still have to develop their own immune system so that they can protect themselves once they're no longer, getting nutrition from the mother. And we basically have two types of adaptive defenses, our humoral and our cellular immunities. So we're going to do a broad overview of them first, and then we're going to talk about each one individually. So humoral immunity is also known as antibody-mediated immunity, while cellular immunity is cell-mediated immunity. And the reason they get these alternate names is because of the key players. So humoral immunity, the main player here are our antibodies, which are in our humors or our body fluids. Whereas cellular immunity, the key player is living cells, which are your lymphocytes, your T cells and your B cells. Your humoral immunity is going to use those antibodies and target things that are extracellular. So things from the outside that came in, like bacteria and toxins and viruses. Whereas cellular immunity is tackling cellular targets. So it's cells attacking cells. So our healthy cells, our lymphocytes, are attacking cells infected by pathogens, not just like the pathogen on its own, like a cell that's already been infected by a pathogen. They're attacking cancerous cells or even like transplanted cells. For instance, like if you get a skin graft and of someone else's cells, your body can see those transplanted cells as foreign and attack those. The general methodology of the humoral immunity defense is temporarily inactivate targets and then mark them for destruction for phagocytes to basically eat them and get rid of them. Cellular immunity those T cells, those T lymphocytes can directly kill infected cells, or they can indirectly release chemicals that will then enhance, coordinate, and activate other parts of the immune system until those infected cells get killed. All right, so now we're going to talk about each one. So, humoral immunity, overseen by the B lymphocytes or your B cells. These are white blood cells. They are made and matured in your red bone marrow, which we mentioned in concept 2. When a B cell encounters an antigen, so again, something it sees as foreign, it's going to cause a humoral immune response. So the antigen is going to bind to surface receptors, and that's going to cause the B cell to be activated. And then B cells are going to proliferate and differentiate into either plasma cells or memory cells. So the plasma cells they make we consider them the effector cells. And what they do is these plasma cells will secrete antibodies that then are going to circulate in our blood and lymph. And they will either inactivate antigens by neutralization, agglutination, and precipitation. And then that's going to help enhance phagocytosis. Or they'll mark antigens for destruction, and that'll lead to complement proteins being activated, which will lead to enhancing the inflammatory response or inflammation, and eventually lead to cell lysis. So when I say like neutralization, all that really means is it's a way of using the antibodies to basically mask over the dangerous parts of a toxin or virus so that they can't bind a receptor. So that helps the phagocytes eat them. The agglutination is basically the antibodies bind to cells and then clump them together so the phagocytes can eat them easier. And then the precipitation is soluble molecules kind of dissolve the antibodies and gather up the antigens also in this kind of like precipitated antigen molecule clump, if you will, and then again the phagocytes can eat them more easily. So we're using antibodies basically to try to kill stuff is the simplest way I can boil that down. Your plasma cells have tons of rough ER so that they can mass produce these antibodies. Like they can make 2,000 antibodies per second if they need to, which is pretty crazy. And there are considered to be 5 classes of antibodies, but I'm not going to dive into their structure or anything. Now, some B cells, when they're activated, will proliferate and differentiate into memory cells. So the plasma cells are the effector cells. They're going to be doing stuff with the antibodies. The other ones are going to become memory cells, and that's going to allow the body to remember and respond more quickly to whatever this antigen is if it encounters it again in the future. And so that's going to yield this immunological memory that is unique to the adaptive defense system. So for instance, in this picture, you have some virus with antigens on it, markers that your body recognizes as foreign. A B cell sees those, the receptor binds that antigen, it gets activated. A lymphoblast is just an immature cell in your bone marrow that's going to mature into a mature lymphocyte. So that's just an intermediary step I don't care if you learn about. But basically, that B cell gets activated as it's matured, and then it'll either become plasma cells, which will secrete antibodies, or it'll become a memory cell that will remember this for the future. And this memory thing happens naturally. Like, you pick up strep throat at school, and then memory cells will remember that for the next time you get exposed to the strep bacteria. But it can also happen artificially. Like, if you get a vaccination, you're exposed to something and it'll hopefully help you remember it for the future. So we kind of look at it, humoral immunity, as either active or passive. So active is where your body is basically going to work to build a memory bank of the said antigens. And this can happen naturally or artificially. So natural active humoral immunity is, you get infected by something, or you come in just being in contact with a pathogen. Maybe it doesn't make you sick, but that's a natural way that you've been exposed to this said pathogen, and your body's going to actively create a response to it for the future. It can also be artificially required. So we can artificially give you a vaccine that either has a dead pathogen in it or an extremely weakened pathogen, to expose your immune system to it and then force it to actively make a memory of it for in case it gets exposed again in the future. Passive is where you're going to be obtaining immunity, but your body didn't build it on its own, if that makes sense. So this happens naturally, for mothers as they're growing fetuses, and their placenta is passing antibodies to them, and so they're naturally just acquiring immunities from the mother. It also happens, like we said, through breast milk in infants as well from the mother. But it can also happen artificially. We can inject you with antibodies that weren't made by your body, so that then you have a way of attacking. So I think that's pretty fascinating. So I mentioned vaccines, so I want to go into that for one more second. A vaccination is a substance used to stimulate your immune system to guard against attack. We're using it to prevent viral and bacterial diseases. And essentially how it works is it exposes your immune system to antigens before you actually get infected by them. So your immune system can make memory cells so that it'll remember it for the future. It's basically tricking your immune system so that it'll learn how to make the antibodies for that specific antigen and then remember that, so that if later on in life you're exposed to the real thing, you're exposed to the measles, or you're exposed to rubella, or you're exposed to the mumps, your body will have a decreased response time and be able to attack it easily. They're typically made from an activated virus or part of a virus or bacteria, like a dead pathogen or a weakened virus. And again, they're just stimulating your immune system to react and preparing your body for future invasions that would be more intense. And vaccines only work because of herd immunity. So when enough people are vaccinated, the microbes aren't able to spread. Another term for this is community immunity. And there's a really awesome 5-minute video we're going to watch in class that kind of explains what this means and why herd immunity is so important. We're also going to stop in class and do a research activity on this, because this is kind of a hot topic social issue in terms of being pro-vaccine or not. And so I want to analyze that with y'all as my students. But for the sake of the video, because we're already getting long-winded, I'm going to keep pushing through. So cellular immunity is the other branch of the adaptive defense system. So we talked about humoral, which is using B cells and their antibodies to attack foreigners. And then we also have cellular immunity, which is using cells to attack other cells. So it's directed by T lymphocytes or T cells, and which are white blood cells that are made in your red bone marrow but mature in your thymus. So we talked about that in concept 2. And again, this is your special forces unit in your cells. It causes inflammation, it activates macrophages, and it regulates your immune response. These T cells basically have 3 main types of effector cells. Helper T or Th cells These are helping to activate B cells, other T cells, or macrophages, and then also just directing the adaptive immune response as a whole. So, like you can see in this picture, how a helper T cell is binding to the B cell and helping activate it when the antigen is present by secreting these interleukins, and thus the B cell can make plasma effector cells to secrete antibodies, and it can make memory B cells to remember it for the future. So they're working hand in hand. Another type of effector T cell are the cytotoxic T cells, or the TC cells. These are directly attacking and killing other cells. If you remember earlier, I talked about they work like natural killer cells in that they trigger apoptosis in cells. Instead of engulfing them themselves, they cause the cells to kill themselves. And then there's also regulatory T cells, or Treg cells, which are just helping to moderate the immune response as a whole. So, something that's really important about T cells is they cannot recognize and respond to antigens like B cells do. So they have to rely on antigen presenting cells, or APCs. These are cells that engulf antigens, and then they break apart the antigen into fragments, and they present those fragments on the surface of their cells. It's almost like kind of disturbing. It's like they rip up this foreign object and then like wear it like a crown on their head, and this allows the T cells then to recognize that antigen because of the APC that's essentially wearing it, and thus the T cell can then respond to them. So the major types of APCs are the dendritic cells in the skin we talked about in unit concept 1, that use their cytoplasmic extensions to kind of like catch antigens and take them in. And then they'll bring them to T cells through the lymphatic vessels and meet T cells in the lymph nodes, where your lymph nodes are then filtering the lymph, and the T cells can hopefully attack them there. There's also macrophages that are APCs. Macrophages are distributed throughout the lymphoid organs and connective tissue, and they help phagocytize the antigens or activate T cells to do so. And then B cells present antigens to helper T cells, which then can in turn activate those. So everything's working together. And then last but not least, I want to mention how T cells get activated. Basically, you have a virus, and then you have some sort of, that should say APC, I'll fix that. Some sort of APC, antigen presenting cell, like a macrophage, presenting the antigen in its fragments. Then the helper T cell can basically recognize it and bind it, and then activate, the cytotoxic T cell to then attack or for another response to happen. And so in class, we're going to stop and just kind of make a flow chart to summarize this, because I know that was so much to take in. But hopefully you found it as interesting as I do. And that is the immune system.